We now have Liz Neeley, who headed off towards a PhD in marine biology, has always had a great love for fish that remains unexplained in anything I've ever read. Wound up rooting around on the bottom of the ocean, reestablishing oyster reefs. And one of the things that particularly appeals to her, and this is why you need to open your Twitter account now, if you have one, is that she's really quite the expert in the use of social media to spread the word about science. She does that on behalf of a nonprofit organization called Compass, which exists to help scientists communicate better. And now we're going to hear from her about the way she sees the use of social media.
Thank you,
Liz?
Jack. How many of you are tweeting today from the meet? Oh, great. All right. So, as you know, the hashtag, I'm just at Liz Neeley. And one of the sayings we have at Compass that sort of drives everything we do is you only get in trouble with people when you mess with their expectations. And unfortunately, as the Assistant Director of Science Outreach, most of my job is to travel around to universities and mess with the expectations of professors when it comes to how does journalism work, what do these reporters want from us, and what on earth is going on with social media. And when I get invited to these kinds of things, I think the expectation of me is it's going to be something like this, an explosion of apps and all the tools, getting distracted by the bells and whistles of which platform should I really be on. There's so many. And then there's this undercurrent, I think this unspoken thread too. It's like, hey, we're all splashing around in here. The water's fine, come on in. And all the cool kids are doing it. And if you don't, maybe we'll mock you. There's this idea that maybe it's all about a popularity contest that does not sit well with most of us. And so they see that, but then they also want it, right? They want me to come in and show these examples of mastery of social media, these people surfing powerful waves of things going viral. Who doesn't want to be that guy, the kings and queens of content creation online? But unfortunately for most of us who are trying to communicate science or are really interested in how this is happening in online spaces, our reality maybe is a little bit more like this to begin with. So if you're just dipping your toes into this ocean, if you're not sure that you ever even want to have anything to do with it, you're in great company. Most of the researchers that I know, it's changed over the years. It used to be sort of a spectrum from healthy skepticism to just outright hostility. There's more interest now because of how powerful these tools are, but the reality is not every entry into the world of social media is particularly graceful, nor is it necessarily the right time for everybody to be diving in. And so you will not hear from me sort of unabashed cheerleading about this is the most magical and amazing thing ever, though I kind of believe that personally. What you will hear from me is what I think everybody in this room needs to understand is the way that these technologies are changing how information is flowing through our societies and our networks, and to appreciate the power that is in that far beyond 8 million hits on a YouTube video or something like that, but what this can do for science and for science communication. And so when I'm talking to researchers or anybody who's trying to think about getting into social media, this is the argument that resonates for me personally the most too. I don't have time to learn yet another set of things on top of the grants I need to be writing, the research I'm doing, mentoring my students, and quite frankly, this stuff is not in this formula of success for academics, right? That's not rewarded. And so what you're saying is, I don't have time for this. And all of us, whether we're academics or not, we don't have time for anything that doesn't come out favorably in this calculation of what is the return on my investment in this stuff. And so when I think about this equation, I often see people underestimating the returns and overestimating the required investments. And so I want to sort of unpack some of that stuff today. And another part of what I do in my trainings is we always force people to come back to this central question. So what? Right? Social media and all this cool stuff, so what, who cares? Why does this matter? As I was planning my talk, I went back to our original inspiration for this question. Any musicians in the room? Recognize this song? So What? Miles Davis, right? And so for me, I love music, but I don't know very much about it. And so when I think about what else could I understand other than just listening to this song, sitting there trying to figure out what my slides were gonna look like, I hopped over to SoundCloud. And this is a service where, as the song is playing, people can annotate it. And so as I read these little comments popping up along the timeline, I'm starting to learn things about the so what chord, right? I had no idea that this was actually a chord voicing in jazz, if you're into this kind of thing, that's made up of 3 perfect fourths followed by a major third. Now I can say those words, but it doesn't mean very much to me. And quite frankly, when I read these Wikipedia articles, which are crowdsourced, it's too deep in the jargon for me to follow. So what did I do? I popped over to a forum called I Breathe Music. And this is a place where students, people who are trying to master musical instruments, and those who are already on top of their craft share stories and tacit knowledge and help each other understand what's going on. The most powerful thing I found here was, in order to remember the difference between a perfect fourth and a perfect fifth, you can listen to the first 2 notes of the Top Gun theme song. All right, so now we all know what a perfect fifth sounds like because we've got those first 2 notes. And so I was sitting there thinking, I still don't really know very much about this, but I remember my friend telling me on Facebook that she missed her ferry because she was listening to an NPR piece about, of all things, mosquitoes and the fact that males and females have flight tones because of the way they beat their wings, and when they come together, there's some musical magic.
We go to mosquitoes now. In an unusual experiment, scientists have discovered something romantic about the sounds of mating mosquitoes. The male and female of one species perform a duet of truly operatic skill. NPR's Christopher Joyce has this story about a flight of acoustic fancy.
The female mosquito of the species Aedes aegypti will not mate with just any male who flies by. First, the male must produce the right flight tone. That's the sound made by his beating wings.
When the male now is brought close to the female, what we see is an acoustic interaction. There's going to be variation in the flight tones. The male will adjust whatever he's been doing to bring about a match.
What they do is vary the pitch of their flight tones until they're a perfect duet. The male's pitch is at about 600 cycles per second, the female's a little lower at 400 cycles per second. In music, he's roughly a D and she's about a G. And then something very special happens. If you listen closely, you can detect a third tone, an overtone in musical terms, fainter, more ghostly than the 2 main mosquito tones, up at 1200 cycles per second. Okay, it's no Madame Butterfly, but hey, these are bugs.
All right, so why am I regaling you with this flight of fancy that I just went on? Is it the case that social media just fed my addiction to the brain candy that appeals to me, and I was just going all over the place, not paying attention and not digging deep into any one arena? I hear these criticisms a lot. Social media makes us shallow. It reduces our attention spans. For me, I actually see this very differently. I think of it as a virtual Library of Alexandria. And it's this beautiful combination of expert knowledge, of the researchers studying the mosquitoes, the professional journalists telling that story, the tacit knowledge, these students talking about, I don't really understand this, can you help me, right? And the beauty of this is it's contextualized. It's hyperlinked to each other, so we can better understand things in context, the reaction and the counter-reaction, the history of how something came to be. When I think about history and social media, I think it's important to recognize that this is somehow, not completely, but in some important ways, fundamentally different than all the technological innovations that have come in terms of communication technology. So if we think about 1440, innovation of the printing press, we were able to go from monks scribing right, the written word, into producing pamphlets and books and newspapers. And all of a sudden, you can have that explosion of information reaching a much larger number of people. And then as each of these innovations marches on, we're able to bring in more and more of our senses so that things are streaming into our living rooms. We can see those photographs, those images, and we can hear the sounds. But what unites all of this is that it was producer generated. That means it was expensive, it required specialized equipment, and so there were powerful editors and anchormen who determined what news was fit to print. With the innovation of Web 2.0, new media, social media, whatever you'd like to call this, what we've done is moved into an era of user-generated content where all of us with our iPhones, a laptop, a Wi-Fi connection, can be out in the world describing what it is we're seeing, reacting to each other, having arguments on the fly. And so this is what makes it different, is that these powerful gatekeepers, they're still important. You know, you heard earlier Dominique talking about media effects. But there are many more sources of information that we can explore. And instead of just thinking, oh, it's too big, there's too much, what I like to do is take a big step back, look at the researchers in the audience, and say, I'm going to build a case for you about the ways that you might use social media to advance yourself and your own career, to assist with the science you're attempting to do, and then also for the betterment of society writ large. So I'm going to show you some examples in each of these that might be familiar or might be new. One of the things that I find I have in common with a lot of people who've been in science is that feeling of being in the lab in an afternoon, you're lonely, you're beating your head against your computer because you can't get your code to work or you can't get an experiment to work. And sometimes we need to be able to talk about this. So here's an example in which a guy I know named Chuck, he really desperately needed some help with his R code. And in the course of just a couple of minutes, I was able to connect him to a professor at my university who teaches how to do R, and we solved that problem. Other things you might be wanting to do in academia would be purchasing equipment for your lab as a new faculty member. So this is Jacqueline Gill trying to debate the merits of water baths versus beads for these PCR systems she needs to do. And you can keep digging into this stuff. It's really exciting. But moral support, advice, and sort of methodological troubleshooting are only some of the elements that we might need to be making our science better. Quite frankly, sometimes it might be money that we need. How many of you have ever supported like crowdfunding, Kickstarter, or other kinds of, okay. So the idea here is that people just put projects together and they ask for money. This is an example from a friend of ours, Craig McLean, who studies woodfall. So it's on the site experiment.com. You go, you see what they're asking for, and you can browse down to get a description of the project and a video.
Each day a tree dies. Its carcass may lay there on the forest floor ravaged by fungus, insects, and plants. But perhaps the tree meets a watery grave. And so begins our story with a tree sinking into the deep.
Is anybody keeping track of the number of musical genres we've had today so far mentioned? Because that was dubstep, if you don't recognize it. But this was a video produced by another one of our friends, Sarah Kiertz, and it was not expensive, it was not professionally done. But as you go through this project, you also see exactly sort of the credentials of the researchers doing it, deeper explanation, citations, and then transparency in terms of what the budget is going to be used for. And in fact, this project, excitingly, was just fully funded a week ago today. I think that the powerful part for crowdfunding for me is not that it solves a lack of money necessarily, but rather that it changes the relationship between the people formerly known as the audience who are now becoming potentially funders or collaborators in the process of the science. That happens as well when you look at crowdsourced projects. This is Foldit. It's at my own University of Washington, and they have 300,000 users. Housewives, teenagers, people who play this game, and your entire task is to try and make a better crystalline protein structure. So you're reducing stress on bond angles or open spaces in those protein configurations, and they've gamified it. So when you're doing well, this happens. You get confetti and music, gold coins, you beat people on a leaderboard. And this is more than just simply fun. They are able to solve problems that we can't with our best supercomputers. They've already found a new protease structure for HIV, and they're currently working on influenza. There's plenty of other crowd-sourced data projects like this. It's not the best fit for every kind of research, but it certainly is exciting because we always talk about, oh, we want people to understand the process of science. This actually allows them to do that. And it's not just changing our relationship with the process of science that I think is powerful and exciting, and I don't hear people talking about that when they say social media, but perhaps changing our relationship with nature as well. Too often we hear, oh, all the screen time, it takes us away from nature, it disconnects us from the world. But I have a counterexample to that. This is Margaret Rubega. She is the state ornithologist of Connecticut and a professor at University of Connecticut. She teaches an introductory ornithology class, so birds, and she forces her students to tweet on the hashtag birdclass, so bird sightings and behavior. And this is the kind of thing they say. Birds under a car, and then what they're doing. Saw a crow preening and why he was doing that. And the best part is she has data showing that these students continue to tweet on this hashtag long after they've left the class. And when I ask her, Margaret, is this working? Why do you do it? What do you get excited about? This is what she says, that it is seeing people talk colloquially and sort of fondly of wildlife on social media. She feels like she's worked her way into their head and made them actually care about these birds, much beyond simply passing the class. Finally, I think social media potentially has the power to even go further than changing our relationship with the process of science or with nature, to even changing our relationship with ourselves and what we see ourselves as being capable of. So Hope Jahren is a researcher at University of Hawaii, another botanist among us, and she hurt her finger in the lab and was getting on Twitter to ironically tweet lab manicure because she'd kind of ripped her fingernail off. And Manicure Monday popped up as an autofill suggestion. She didn't know what that was. It's a 17 magazine weekly sort of photo roundup where people tweet pictures of their manicures. And she thought, we can take this over. We're going to hijack it. Hope is brash like that. But these are the kinds of pictures that came out of this, right? You see this whole diversity of hands, tagging sharks, writing code, launching satellites. Some of them have fingernail polish, some of them are manicured, many of them are not. And not only did this happen like this was just a trend on Twitter, but then it gets picked up in the traditional media as well. So here's Hope on MSNBC saying,
I think it's vital to give girls the message early on that what your hands can do is more important than how they look.
Right? Chuck Palahniuk, who wrote Fight Club, if you remember, if you've read those books, has this quote that I love. He says, "Stone rots, wood crumbles, people, well, we die. But things as fragile as a hope, a dream, an idea, these things go on and on. If you can change the way someone sees the world, the way they see themselves, that's the only thing you truly can change." So that's why I get excited about social media. But I also know that my own levels of excitement, like I have goosebumps standing up here talking about this, not shared. I also know I nerd and geek out about science, not a good example of the general public. So if this kind of inspirational stuff doesn't really work for you, that's okay. I've got some pragmatic arguments. You've seen this before from Dominique. We're talking about changes in media consumption trends. When you look at this Pew Internet Research data over time, the only increasing line there is your digital and your mobile news. And if you don't like looking at graphs and are more visual like I am, imagine if you mapped tweets in blue and Flickr images in orange, where they occur as white. These all have geotag information so you can see where they are in the world. It starts to make these maps of where people are tweeting and sharing photographs. So there's Europe, there's Manhattan, and yes, there certainly is a digital divide and there are large swaths of the world that don't have access to the internet, but this is Sao Paulo, Brazil. I can show you pictures of Jakarta. This is really exciting. And sometimes we get swept up in our own excitement. We're like, millions and millions of people are online. We're gonna make our stuff go viral. And I say, I'm really sorry, but this is what goes viral. These things that are bizarre and funny, they're crass, it's Richard Dawkins and Darwin rapping together. These are the things that go viral. We are more like, I'm more likely to go viral because I accidentally fall off stage today than because of anything I'm deliberately doing. This is my favorite part of building these presentations, is adding what's the latest, right? Sophia, Doge. Just because we can't go viral, many of us, just because we can't get millions or hundreds of thousands, or quite frankly, thousands of hits on the things we might be putting out there, that doesn't mean our time is wasted. I think the beauty of the internet is that it allows us to aggregate diffuse audiences. That means you don't have to be in the top 100 most popular anything. You can have your own bizarre little community of people who like Ukrainian hip-hop remix stuff, like I do. But you can find that community, and it's getting those people together who care that I think is really powerful. And this, for me, counteracts this old trope. I get really tired of internet arguments. I get really tired of social media arguments about, oh, it's not real. It's just a bunch of people wasting their time online. Well, that's true for some of us, but it is real. This is a group of people doing remarkable things. Have you heard of the maker movement, or 3D printers? So they are building mechanical hands for children who are missing limbs. They're controlled by wrist movement. So they print these out on their mechanical printers, are paired up with families, and they're sending these to children all over the world, right? If you want to look for more from them, it's Eid/Nabel on Facebook. My account should be tweeting these links. But I think we have to change our approach to this, to understand, why are we communicating? Why are we getting online? Why do we want people to understand science? And what will we be satisfied by as a measure of success? And so I think building better mental models and sort of theories of change is a more valuable use of our time than arguing about whether WhatsApp is better than Voxer, is better than, Snapchat, for the next thing that's coming. So, now, everything I've told you is interesting, I hope. I certainly think so. But a lot of other people could have told you this as well. So I wanted to close out my remarks by focusing on what I bring to this that I think is different. And so for me, the most exciting and the most important part about social media is that indeed it is social. A lot of us want to force it into that broadcast mode, that it's just another channel by which we can reach a whole bunch of people. And it's not. And so my background is in animal behavior. You heard Jack mention this, communication. These were the kind of slides I was producing, and oh my goodness, you would not have recognized me. I tried so hard to come up with describing what I did, and it was tweetable, I think. I think the characters work. I would say, I study the synonymous to non-synonymous substitution ratios in the transmembrane regions of rhodopsins in wrasses and parrotfish. Crystal clear, right? Very precise. And it took a reporter covering my work to show me what I actually did. I was interested in reef systems. Coral reef fish to us look very bright and colorful. It's very busy. The backgrounds, they're crazy colors. I wanted to understand when one of them was a signal and they had a message that they wanted a receiver to pay attention to, whether it was mate with me or don't come in my territory. How was that interaction shaped by the quality of the light, the background, the behaviors of the fish, and so forth? And that behavioral emphasis, I dug out this old paper. I tweeted about this too. This was an undergraduate review paper I wrote, and the title is awesome because it's talking about eavesdropper effects in social networks. And the argument I make on the first page is that too often we think of communication as an interaction between maybe a male, big showy guy, and they are showy. These are this is a greater sage grouse. And so you see these two together because they're a lekking species. A lek, L-E-K, that means that dozens of male will share like a big area of prairie. They kind of set up their own territories, and then they do their displays as the females come around like, hey, look at me, I am the best greater sage grouse that ever prowled these prairies. And because what they do is so showy, right? And these are expensive signals. We spend a lot of time thinking like, ooh, is it like a super, super yellow that's really attractive, or should he be like orangish yellow? How loud is that signal, and can he make it louder somehow, and is that more attractive? And we tend to think of communication like that. looking only at that messenger. And instead, what we really need to remember is that's only the beginning of the conversation, right? That what he's doing is performing, and then that performance is transmitted somehow through whatever that medium might be. We're used to thinking about air as if it doesn't matter, but in water, you really see it gets turbid and dark and cloudy, or the way that light looks at shallow depths is very different than at deep depths, right? And even more importantly, it's not just the two of them, but rather you have audience effects where everybody's looking at what everybody else is doing. And so understanding this much broader context as social media, as social communication, is really valuable. And I want to tell you 3 brief stories pulling from animal behavior and communication to sort of illustrate my take-home points on this. The first, this is work on lemon damselfish. These are 2 different species, though if I asked you to distinguish among the 2 of them by looking at them, it's pretty hard, right? They look pretty much the same to us, to our eyes. But if you look at them under UV light, if we could see that, suddenly they have these patterns that are very bright and clear and distinctive to them. The really cool thing about ultraviolet light in fish is that not everybody can see it. Most of the predators don't, because it essentially constitutes visual noise. If everything's reflecting in this wavelength, it helps you to have better contrast if you don't see it. So these guys are communicating with each other in a sort of private bandwidth, right? I think this is really exciting because it brings home this point that everyone says, oh, but the internet's so overwhelming, it's all this noise. I just want the signal that I really care about. And that signal is different for each of us. So Clay Shirky, who's a writer, he focuses on the internet and the future of social media and was born here in Columbia, though he's in New York now, says this. I think this is an iconic quote. There is no such thing as information overload. There's only filter failure. So we don't really want to try and damp down what we sort of pejoratively call noise on the internet. We just want to be able to get the right signals for what we care about, which sounds lovely in theory, but it's not quite that easy. So what do we do, right? For most of us, when we're making decisions in an area that's uncertain and perhaps costly, we look to those we trust. And this is shared among many species, including Norwegian rats. So in this instance, females who are trying to figure out which male to mate with, getting that wrong has costly consequences for them. And so they will actually perform what we call mate choice copying. Well, they'll look to older, more experienced females and then copy whoever she says, okay, this one's the one. They also do food choice copying. When they're first learning which foods are most nutritionally valuable, they'll again look to older, more experienced rats to help them make those choices when they don't have that information. And we do this as well, right? We all know, we have talked about trust repeatedly, that we rely on those who have done the work to do it for us when we have to. This is Dan Kahan, whose name's come up a couple of times, arguing that none of us, no matter how scientific we are, know in detail all the scientific complexity and specifics of anything, of all the things that it makes sense for us to know, so much as to simply trust that science knows that and we know people who speak about that science. And so for me, in a social media context, this brings up a theme of familiarity. Who do you trust? Part of it is, how do I assess you, based on Dominique's tights and the fact that she told you she was a professor, color of my dress, those things. But we also make assessments based on familiarity. It's just, oh, I know this person, they've been around, I can talk to them, it's easy. And you see this when we think about stereotypes of scientists. This is a classic experiment. You've seen it from the Fermi labs. They asked 7th graders what a scientist looks like to draw it. This is what they drew. They wrote paragraphs as well, which were really adorable, about these crazy mad scientists, quite frankly, all of whom are old and white, wearing lab coats, doing dangerous experiments. When they were brought in to meet actual physicists and researchers at Fermi Lab, the pictures change afterwards. And suddenly you see a better representation of the reality of who is doing science. So there's a Tumblr called This Is What a Scientist Looks Like that's just collecting images of all the people in all the different disciplines living the reality of their life. Yes, scientists are a unique breed, but we are just like everybody else as well. And breaking down some of those stereotypes by virtue of being familiar can be powerful. So Emily Willingham is a freelancer, and she wrote in Forbes, perhaps what we need to do is take a big step back away from thinking about how do we hit the most people over the head with our science, and instead become trusted nerd nodes. I like this phrase because I'm a network thinker, but if you imagine each of us in the room as these blue dots, and then the white lines between us, are you following me on Twitter? Do we email and talk about stuff? We all have an intuitive sense of what it feels like to be in different locations in a network, right? So if we're out there, we're lonely because you only have one friend at the whole conference. It's hard to find them. You don't get much information, right? We all also know what popularity looks like. Who doesn't want to know the most people in the room? But I think that aiming for that kind of popularity is part of what's, this race to game the system, get the biggest number of followers, and it's not really strategic. It doesn't make sense to me. Rather, there are some terms that I think are really valuable. So in network science, closeness has to do with degrees of separation. So these are the people who are the connectors, right? Another way that you might connect communities is being there. This is called the betweenness. So you're the person who, maybe you don't know a ton of people, but you're the only one who knows people in two communities who don't talk to each other. And I think these are better strategic goals for when you're thinking about, why am I online? What am I doing? Other than looking at pictures of cats. And we have friends and colleagues who are doing precisely this. This is Danielle Lee at Dean Lee 5. She was just recognized by the White House 2 weeks ago for her work in increasing STEM diversity. She's also founding this National Science Technology News Service where African American professionals, journalists, and scientists are stepping up and saying, I'm available as a source, I'm interested in these kinds of stories, because they haven't been well connected and well represented in these spaces before. On a similar note, Monica Feu Moher, she is with a group called Ciencias Puerto Rico. They're doing the same thing, because for Puerto Rico in particular, there's been a talent drain where people, engineers, doctors, scientists, disperse. And so their goal is to help people who identify as members of this community to connect to others, to share their stories, to increase representation, and to do a better job of supporting diversity in science. I'm losing my voice, I have some water. But really, so my point here is we need to think about the shape and the structure of networks just as much as we have to think about how many nodes are in them. And the final thing is, when we start thinking like that, we realize that everybody's watching. We're really, really good at watching what other people are doing and making judgments of them. Other animals that do this include, well, all of them, but these are beta splendid, these fighting fish, right? What's so fun is if you take two aggressive males and you put them in a tank, they're going to fight. But they fight in a very different way if it's just the two of them alone, or if there's an observer. And they fight in a different way if that observer is a female. Instead of attacking each other physically, they'll do a little bit more display, like, oh, look at how good my fins look as I punch him or bite him, right? So the way that we change our behaviors based on what we see other people or fish see other fish doing is my final point, and I think it's a valuable and important one, and it doesn't sit easily, right? In sort of the popular discussion, when we say, oh, likes are so cheap, it's so easy to just be, oh, I like that, it's just slacktivism. And worse, you get these sort of winner-take-all popularity effects where I like something, and then other people who like me or want to be part of my network, they all like it too, and so it's all popping up, right? And somehow this feels like it cheapens things, that people don't actually like a band, they just want to be seen as a person who likes that band. There's an amazing project going on at Princeton right now called Music Labs, where you can experimentally manipulate how much information people have about what other kinds of music other people like. And what's really cool here is that in low information systems where like I don't know what anybody else thinks and I just rank those songs, the good ones rise to the top and it's pretty predictable. But when I can see other people saying, I'm good, thank you, I like this or I'm good, it becomes less and less predictable. The best songs always do fairly well. The worst songs never seem to raise very high, but everything else in the middle, it varies wildly just depending on which were the first ones to get likes. So I hope you go home and play with this because I think this research is really interesting. And like I said though, it doesn't quite sit well with me. You hear, this idea that we're just cheapening everything because we're consuming it, not even for our own enjoyment, but to be seen consuming it. And so I sat here looking at this slide for a while, swinging my arms like this, because this is what I do. And then I realized, hey, this to me kind of looks like a flock of birds. And when I think about flocks of birds, I think about this is a murmuration of starlings. And this re-inspires me because I think we don't ask our starlings good or bad because they fly in flocks. I think we need to stop arguing about social media and whether it brings out the best or the worst of us. The answer is yes, it does to all of that. But if we can take a step back and become fascinated by the dynamics, by studying and understanding this process, then I think we'll actually start to make progress and understand better how we move through the world as a species. So in closing, I will say, my hope, maybe my impossible dream, is that we can break out of these old entrenched arguments, that we can start to think more broadly and to be interdisciplinary in our thinking. I was hoping to live what I was saying, giving you this talk full of animal behavior and science communication. And so the final things to take away are, when it comes to social media, don't dismiss it before you understand what it actually can do. And understand that not all of us see it the same way. Different communities experience the web in a very different way. I hope that you will aim to build better networks and have a more strategic sense of what you're doing, who you want to connect to, and why. And then finally, I would say, we have an opportunity right now to blend the best of all possible worlds, right? Get online, make art, make stuff, take chances, pursue your artistic or journalistic attempts at making things that have a strong aesthetic component as well as sort of the intellectual rigor of communicating science. Take chances, treat it like an experiment, and then analyze the results, use the social science, and I think together we can make something really fantastic. So there's my cheerleading part, but thank you.
Next one in there. Couple.
We have time for just a couple of questions.
I was just wondering if there was a social media outlet that scientists have been most effective at using, like Twitter, Facebook, or whatever.
I'm going to ask you a question back. What do you mean by effective?
Okay, maybe I mean most active. What do you find is the most popular amongst scientists?
Yeah, I'm so mean. I'm going to be so mean to you right now because I don't think that we can say all scientists act as a group. Like you see different disciplines doing very different things. The mathematicians, I think, were early adopters to the blogs, and we're doing collaborative problem solving in the comment sections of some of those. I do see some meetings are very busy and very buzzy. I think the space people are fantastic examples of very busy. The chemistry folks also take the lead. But really, it totally depends. Like, is it social media for science communication because we're solving problems collaboratively, like in-reach, I think some people call that? Is it because we're trying to build communities of activists who really care about shark conservation? There's so many different things that I can't give an adequate question, or can't give an adequate answer.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hi there. Hey. You mentioned how people use Twitter to get advice and to share about causes they care about and to get access to a whole new library of information, but how do you recommend that we make useful interactions on Twitter when our contexts are so limited?
Yeah, so I would say this is part of that sort of ramping up period, is figure how do you connect to the influencers who are important in your space, whatever it might be. And start with the obvious, I'm a resource to you because I'm here. So all you have to do is tweet at me. And if you have a question, I'll retweet it or I'll say, you can connect to so-and-so. But there has to be, I feel like this is like doing your homework. We're really used to doing that in every other realm. But in social media, you need to spend some time reading, listening, watching what the ethos is of the community, who are the people who seem to be influential or powerful. And then, for the most part, just reach out and try. It's amazing for me in Twitter, which is where I'm most active, how that flattens these hierarchies where, Michael Mann was tweeting at us today because he was picking up stuff from Twitter, from Bill Nye's talk. It's exciting. And don't worry, I know a lot of people are like, oh, but my first tweet, I don't know what to say and I'm paralyzed by mine was terrible. Mine said something like, how many times am I gonna reheat this cup of coffee? But nobody cares because nobody was paying attention.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Because most college students now use social media and know how to use it,
Yeah.
do you think it will change how social media is used in the future with the base of knowledge?
I absolutely do, because I think, and this is just me talking from my own experience, a lot of social media talks have been aimed at people who were not digital natives, of like, we're gonna teach you how to create a Facebook account or something like that. I think that will continue to be useful because there's always gonna be new stuff coming on. So even though we're all up to our eyeballs in it right now, in 10 years' time, unless we keep making that investment, then we'll need to be retaught. But I think the most important thing is that just like that flock of starlings, none of these technologies are permanent. We can't guarantee how long Twitter is going to be around or anything else like that. So we're always having to reinvent social norms and figure out new ways of using these, both on the technological side as well as on the social side. Yes, thank you. So last question? Yeah.
Yep.
There's a lot of misinformation on the internet and
That's right.
information. Do you think that social networking has been more positive than negative in getting out scientific information,
That is
true information?
Great question. I feel like it's a double-edged sword, right? Because some of the things that make misinformation really powerful is either if it aligns with people's pre-existing worldviews, and when you build networks of people who all agree with each other, you get this echo chamber, you give them information that satisfies what they already believe is true, and then they tend to polarize themselves or to become even more extreme. That's certainly a concern. Unfortunately, I think all too often scientists come into this and say, we're gonna fix that by giving them facts. We're gonna give them more facts. As soon as you start doing this with your finger, at any point you know that's a bad strategy. And so I think the other reason that misinformation is compelling in many instances is because it's a great story. It's really satisfying. When the science is complicated and we can't give you a direct answer and all the rest of it, I think I'm excited to hear Randy's talk next because much of the research around debunking myths suggests that it's not enough to simply say, no, that's not true. And in fact, many of us will say, you might have heard that, blah, and just by simply saying that, we've reinforced it because they've heard it again. What we have to do is be able to displace those with equally satisfying narratives. And so, can we do it in social media? Absolutely. Have we done it yet? In some instances, but this is a continuing battle.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
One more quick one.
Okay.
This is from the young child's perspective, because I think everything you're saying is correct, but because of SEPA, we're kind of limited in how we can begin teaching. I would never begin teaching reading to a 12-year-old. So what do you think the impact, or how can you change things as the technology is changing and we want to incorporate children in the way to think and use it correctly? How are we going to do that with the laws the way they are?
Yeah, I can't speak to the laws, but I can speak to a couple of things. One is a common complaint that I've heard and that I've seen in some of my own undergraduates that I've worked with is that they lack information literacy, the ability to discriminate whether a source is reliable or not. And I think working on helping them pick up cues about if you read a claim like this in a web page that looks like this, is this reliable or is it not? Working on those skills is something that is certainly useful. On the other hand, I mean, much of the power of social media is that it is open and you can't control it. You can't make it safe by barring certain people from it. And so this question of how do kids get introduced to these things,
But why do we wait till they're 12?
Oh, I didn't.
I think it's an interesting, it is, you wait till you're 12 till you can read and write. And I'm just interested if you know anything about how that might change?
I don't do anything with with children. I'm sorry.
Okay.
All right, thank you. Great.